Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark. I'm your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Christopher Lynn. Chris, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
What do you want to know about the me or the professor me or what?
All of it, if you want to advertise a little bit, go right ahead.
So I'm a biocultural medical anthropologist at the University of Alabama, and what that means is I'm trained in a little bit of study in biology and a little bit of culture, and I'm interested in human evolutionary biology and human behavioral ecology. So sort of an evolutionary approach to health and human stuff. My main research lately has been on tattooing and immune response. And how I came to study that is I used to play in rock and roll bands in New York and work in the music industry, and got involved in tattoo culture in the 80s when it was sort of re-emerging from the dark ages and the railroad underpasses. And when I decided to go back to school for anthropology and get my degree, I started thinking how I could combine my interests in evolution and health and biology with some of my hobbies, like playing in bands and getting tattoos. And I started to see some of the synergy happening in things like there was like a punk rock fanzine called Search and Destroy that turned into research and became a bunch of books that looked at both how tattooing was sort of reemerging in counterculture, but also some of the cross-cultural historic aspects of it. And I just got really into that. And one of my favorite quotes came out of that period of time. I was an undergrad at Brooklyn College, and I saw that a tattoo artist historian named Lyle Tuttle, who was one of the people primarily responsible for improving hygiene and sanitation for tattooing and allowing it to sort of enter the mainstream, had noted that tattooing was something you see in folk lore and cultural stories is something that people say makes them tougher. And he thought maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's some antibodies and stuff involved. So even though at the time I was actually studying stress response and group commitment in Pentecostal churches and collecting saliva samples from people speaking in tongues and looking at their health, I also started studying tattooing, and that's sort of where my research has shifted primarily to in the last few years as we got a few papers out. That's a nutshell.
Okay. So, tattooing as a cultural pillar has been going on for a long time, yeah? Um,
Forever.
yeah. So, at what point in history or culturally did people actually see it as an institution, or did it start to become more and more widespread?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And the short answer is we don't know. So everything's speculation. The earliest evidence for tattooing is Utsi the Iceman 5,300 years ago, right? We have that mummy that we found and he's got like 63 tattoos all over his body aligned with acupuncture points, suggesting that they both figured out some sort of some therapeutic aspects of it, but also how to permanently mark the body in ways that they remembered where those spots were. So we can imagine that it's a lot older. And if we are looking at evidence for self-decoration, we can take it all the way back to Homo erectus and see that self-decoration was happening well before even the emergence of Homo sapiens. And we can argue then about when it becomes institutionalized. But I'm with prehistoric archaeologist Aaron Dieter Wolf on this, and I think it's going to emerge pretty much right out of the gate with all forms of self-decoration. All you have to do is accidentally fall down on a asphalt road riding your bike to get a tattoo, right? You scrape yourself, you get some of that asphalt in, stab yourself with a pencil and get some of that pigment in under your skin to realize how easy it is to do a tattoo, and to extrapolate that people figured this stuff out a long time ago.
So the mama you're talking about was Utsi. Is
Mhm.
that right? Yeah.
Yep.
So this is something that you talk. This is something I've heard in probably a freshman level archaeology class that people still talk about this guy, even though he's been found, decades ago.
Yeah, it's found in 92, I believe, in the Italian Austrian Alps right there. Yeah, to date, he is still the oldest confirmed tattooed mummy. We have evidence of tattoo tools, right, around the world as well. But in terms of seeing what type of tattooing people were doing on actual bodies, that's the oldest mummy. Um, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, based on eyebrows and facial gestures of the prehistoric archaeologists I've talked to on our podcast, there's a new find about to be described that probably pushes that date back a bit. But that's the one that you're reading about in your intro, and that still stands.
So you say tattooing tools were found in. Are these tools like set to his culture, or are those tools universal? Because I know tattooing styles are different all over the world. I would assume the tools are different also.
Yeah, we don't know what kind of tools they use for Utzi's tattoos. We just have his tattoos. He doesn't seem to have been the tattoo artist, but we see evidence of tattoo tools all over the world. Anything from um, perpendicularly hafted tools, which means, let me see if I have one around here. I do have one somewhere, probably on my desk. I have a Samoan. Oh, here it is. Right. So a perpendicularly hafted tattoo tools like this, where you have a comb affixed. I don't have it on here, but this is a contemporary Samoan owl, what they use. And this resembles the ones that they have been using throughout Oceania, probably since the Neolithic, it seems to be. But yeah, around in Japan, they would use a stick with the needles parallel and jab in that way. We also see cactus spines. We see carved bone. We see all sorts of different technologies around the world. And the trick for archaeologists, and let's be clear, I'm not an archaeologist, so I am relaying information from people like Aaron Dieter Wolf or Ben Robitaille, who is um, basically an amateur archaeologist trained in archaeology who's made it his life's work to try to develop a taxonomy of these tools. There's very little research that's been done outside these few people on what you're asking, like what's the distribution of tools around the world and how does that match up with styles. So it's I'm going to borrow a quote from Dieter Wolf. It's taken a new generation of tattooed anthropologists, right? Not just anthropologists who themselves have tattoos, but anthropologists growing up in an era when tattooing is mainstream, normal, and considered important, that we're finally getting people who are looking for evidence of tattooing and are looking for tattoo tools, not just when they're doing digs, but in museum archives and collections around the world that are just sitting around. One of the oldest tattoo tools found in North America was described by, I think, Andrew, I'm going to blank out on his last name, Gilreth. It's a hyphenated last name. He's a grad student at, I think, WashU or Washington State, one of those Northwestern colleges up there, where they found in the museum archives these tattoo needles from Utah that had been collected years and years ago that had just been sitting there. So it takes looking for something that might be pigment, might be a shell or something where they would mix the pigments and break down the compounds, or where there might be evidence of needles with pigment on them or blood on them, right? To start to understand these things better. And there hasn't been anyone looking at that till recently. It's almost like, I don't know if you know the work of Dr. Pat McGovern. He's an archaeologist who studies alcohol in antiquity. And it wasn't until recently that he thought to look at old ceramic pots and do chemical analysis of the residue in them to discover what they actually contained. And that sort of ignited the microbrew movement. So we have a similar thing happening with tattoo tools.
So, pigments are different colors that you can get applied to tattoos. You can do that now, but how did they get the different colors back then? I know it's actual like ink that you use now, but I assumed it was, crushed up minerals or insects, depending on what the color is. How would they do that?
It depends on where, as you sort of insinuate in your last question, it depends on where you were, but where you are, what's available. But a basic tattoo, a black tattoo, would be using charcoal and any sort of fluid, anything from urine to water, mixing charcoal. So before they used inks in Samoa, for instance, they used the same nut that they what's it called, aloma nut, I believe. And if you open the nut, it's got a real oily, viscous oil to it, and they burn that oil, and then they basically take the lamp black from the burning of that oil, the charcoal created from it, mix it with water, right, to get a basic black. And then everybody's formulas are slightly different based on how black, right? So for instance, in talking to Sulawape Patelo Aliva'a, who is the contemporary high chief, paramount chief of Samoan tattooing, he would tell me things like he and his brother, who was a famous tattooist who died in 1991, they both shared a similar formula of using the black from one of these nuts with water, or sometimes they'll use alcohol, right? Because alcohol is isopropyl alcohol or something like that, witch hazel. Those are carriers. And as carriers, what it means is they hold the pigment, but actually enter into skin epidermal cells faster than water. So they facilitate that movement into the cells. But they'll also include other compounds like soap, things that help the pigment spread out and integrate into the carrier, right? So to contrast that, you can have pigment that'll clump together and not spread out into the fluid as well. So you have a variety of different carriers used around the world with primarily some type of charcoal. I mean, you can make tattoo ink yourself by burning some wood in your backyard, grinding that up and mixing it with isopropyl alcohol, with shampoo, with something like this. And you can go down a hole on the internet of how people in prison do tattooing to get a kind of a sense of the innovation humans are capable of, and extrapolate from there to what materials would have been available any place in the world. But as you point out, then you've got insects that provide us things like blue. You've got red ochre, which is our classic first pigment that we ever see in the archaeological record, which is an iron oxide that may be used. That's our most widespread and earliest use of self-decoration and pigment. So we have lots of stuff like that. But you won't see a lot of pigment in some of the early stuff. You'll see mostly black, gray shade, and then maybe the introduction of one or two pigments in a few cultures.
Because the colors have grown in variety as human society has advanced. We have new technology, so we can make new things with it, like blue, green, whatever with it.
We can now, and a lot of those colors were highly valued trade goods for a long period of time. You didn't get those locally. So you were limited in pigments that were tattooable, right? I don't know. I'm way out of my depth on this. I know this from thinking about self-decoration in general and less about pigment when it enters tattooing in the archaeological record. But we do know that pigments and colors historically were rare special trade goods. So yes, until a modern era where there's significant trade, there's a limited number of pigments available. And then with the development of chemistry, of chemical pigments, we have problems with what you're putting in your body. Because you have to remember, a lot of these are like iron oxide or metals, right? They're carcinogenic in some cases if you're using charcoals. So when we start to enter the period when tattoos are electrically implemented in the late 19th century, we have the increased use of synthetic pigments. We have skin reactions to these. And so part of the innovations in tattooing over the last 50 years have been refinements in pigments, as well as refinements in how tattoos are administered safely and quickly. And I just had a call from the folks who do, what's the name of that tattoo ink company? Intends, who are at the forefront of developing inks, also started by a tattooist in Austria, Mario, blanking on his last name at the moment, but who are looking to get into the research side of things as well, because obviously a big market share for them is making a variety of safe inks and understanding the interaction between the body and ink. So that's become a whole new area of interest. How do people respond to pigments and different colors?
Yeah, so out of all the instruction he's just given, please don't try this at home and then send us emails saying, hey, I have acute metal poisoning from trying to make my own ink at home, and I completely blame you for this.
Yeah, if you're going to tattoo yourself, it's actually far easier and cheaper just to buy some ink on eBay, as I did, and tattoo needles for that matter, before than making your own.
So I saw a documentary on National Geographic, I think it was, where you can actually plan an entire trip around going to either Tibet or Mongolia, and a woman who lives at the top of a mountain will actually tattoo you in a style that's been hundreds of years old by now. And she is
Wow.
just this tiny little old woman, just takes this needle and just hammers it into you and makes really simple drawings with it. But it is so cool to see somebody do it in an old style like that.
Is that the woman who's now 103 years old?
Yes, she is as old as the technique is by now.
Yeah, I know that she's pretty famous, and I'm glad she's getting widespread recognition. I hope she doesn't mind tattoo tourism coming her way. I think Lars Krutek is largely responsible for bringing the world's attention to her and helping to preserve that practice. He's someone we have not interviewed yet for our podcast, Inking of Immunity, that we're doing, but someone we want to interview. He is, in my opinion, the foremost tattoo anthropologist in the world, and he's traveled to many of these places and met some of the last living purveyors of some of these rare cultural practices, and done things like that to both preserve what's happening, hopefully some economic viability to these practices for subsequent generations. I think it's either the niece or the granddaughter of that woman. It skipped a generation who is learning it also to preserve it. But yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Like with the ubiquity of tattooing around the world, it's 1 in 3 Americans has at least one tattoo now. The argument that I make for Samoan tattooing is the confluence of international interest in tattooing and the rediscovery of some of these indigenous practices has served the whole culture well. So some of the folks who are making a living off of indigenous tattooing practices are able, by sharing them with the world, to get their kids and their grandkids interested in them again, and with some small modifications, say to hygiene and sanitation to make sure they remain safe, have been able to preserve tattooing practices that were that were in many cases lost. Totally, they're gone. They'll never be the same way. Most of the Pacific tattooing was eradicated completely by missionary and colonial efforts in the early 19th century. But it seems to have been preserved, for instance, in Samoa. Japanese methods seem to have been preserved, and folks are relearning them. In Samoa, while one generation taught more than just Samoans how to do these tattoos and make them to preserve it, now that that seems to have been accomplished and the world now cares. And I guess by care, what I mean is it's not just an important cultural practice outside, but it's now prestigious inside the culture again to be doing these things, right? You have to have the culture care about its own culture to preserve it.
So in a way, it's a form of historic preservation.
Yeah. By sharing it with the world, they have managed to preserve their own culture long enough for their own people to become interested in it again and to learn it again.
So in the places that the techniques and stuff have been lost, they're having to rebuild the practice from scratch, right?
Yep, they're learning how to build tools from related peoples near them. You know, so Tahitians and other peoples are learning how to make tools like this from Samoans, and then relearning their own their own designs from textbooks and anthropology documentation and stuff like that.
So they're having to relearn how to build those tools from scratch, and that's wow.
Yeah, and as you can see, you know, they're so one argument for say Ben Robitaille, who's a freelance archaeologist, was trained at the University of Montreal or Toronto, has pointed out you only see this in Oceania, and this used to be a wood with turtle shell. Wood with turtle shell, and then be a boar's tusk or some bone that's carved and affixed right here. And then this is coconut fiber that would be wrapped around, right? So the basic tool can be made by hand, right? And this takes a lot of training, right? So this is building up that knowledge base is difficult without like a lot of interest, and then a paying clientele who want to get tattoos like this, right? Because these are used not for tourists. You get the little small rinky-dink towel like bands around the arms and legs, right? Those are considered sort of tourist tattoos. But the real deal, the traditional cultural pieces that are being done with tools like this are extremely large pieces that are ceremonially very, very important. So you've got a whole set of cultural practices, not just the tattooing, that are being reinvigorated or reclaimed or recontextualized. Tongan and Samoan tattooing, for instance, were almost identical due to a lot of shared history. And so you get some fidelity probably in the revitalization, but certainly a lot of it's lost. And they're creating a new cultural, tattoo practice.
So for somebody to learn this from scratch in any culture, really, they have to start doing this at a really young age to get to a point where they can do it professionally.
I used to think that, but after talking to Sulawape, the high chief, not necessarily. He's had people he's trained who are already tattooers, who are already using electric tattoos. In training his own kids, he'll often tell them to practice on each other with electric tattoo first, just to see if they could draw basic lines, and then to practice with this. So to learn absolutely every aspect of it, it does take a lot of time. So tattooing itself is one part of it. The rest of it, if the Samoans have a saying that translates to tattoo your mouth first. And what that means is tattooing can't be decontextualized from the culture. And what wearing a tattoo means is that you can talk with chiefs, and chiefs have a language of their own, which means not only do you speak your Samoan language, but you speak the chief's language. You know all the titles, and they have elaborate titling system, and you know all the rules of behavior that would allow you to sit among chiefs and speak, right? So a position of prestige. The tattooing is meant in some way to signal that you know all of that stuff. So you don't get these tattoos until you know that stuff. Now, depending on who you ask, that is still in practice, although the requirement of knowing how to speak the language is not as strict, right? Some people get the tattoo on their path to learning their own culture, and others don't. They get it for fashion. That's certainly the case for some people now, right? It's a vocation in our modern day, right? We're in all these cultures have, they're part of the transactional global economy, and they get paid in cash money like the rest of us. And so not everybody speaks the language and knows all of these things. But the debate and the tension among the families who hold this practice right now kind of gets to the heart of your question, which is who legitimately should be allowed to have this knowledge and hold it versus who shouldn't. And I would say part of the transition of generations has been, if we require that people be born here and grow up in it, we are going to lose it, because there's too much noise from the outside world distracting them. A lot of people don't come to an appreciation for their own culture and want this knowledge until they're adults. And some of the people in the middle, I'll call it the middle passage. It probably rings wrong. Doesn't sound good right now. But in the period of time between the 60s, when some of the last traditional, and I'm speaking from the Samoan perspective because that's where I work, when some of the traditional artists were losing people interested in being trained, to now, there was a period of time when these master craftsmen, whose job it is to preserve culture, and that's what chief or the words for chief and the words for master craftsman imply, that they will preserve these cultural practices, right? So part of doing that is finding ways to preserve them even when people are losing interest. And one of the ways that they saw to do that was to train non-Samoans who seemed to be more interested in Samoan culture and traditional tattooing practices than Samoans themselves. So that's what I say. Yeah, it's an aspect of historic preservation that they saw was necessary and engaged in. And now that you have a lot of people able to do this again, you probably bottlenecked at around a handful of people in the world who could do this, to now maybe 100 or more can do this. Now you have people in a position again to clamp back down and say, we don't want to water this down anymore. We want to bring it back to just us, just our culture. And so that's a long anthropological answer to your question, but the answer is it depends on who you're asking.
So I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this.
Sure.
When certain people get these tattoos in Samoa, it's part of their education or showing that they have some kind of trust or prestige within the community, that other people don't have or wouldn't get otherwise.
That's exactly correct.
So, how would a person go about getting a prestige level tattoo? For the Call of Duty fans, I'm going to call it a prestige level tattoo. So that means they've accomplished something in their life to get this tattoo, right?
So who are you asking for? Like what type of person?
Just an average citizen, I guess, is what I would call them.
Samoan or non-Samoan?
I guess Samoan at this point, because yeah.
Okay. So if you're Samoan and you want to get, if you're male, it's a pea. It's that, let me see if I got I don't know where I put all my books. There's a big giant pile around here somewhere. Hang on just a sec. If I can find it quickly. Right on the cover of the book. Maybe I took it home. Oh, wait, no. All right, well, unfortunately, I don't have my book called Tatau handy. It is the most recent sort of book, and it's got a great picture. I have lots of pictures, of course, online that I could show. But a pea is a tattoo for a male, typically, that extends from here to here and wraps all the way around. It almost looks like they're wearing black shorts, comes way up on the hips, has a piece that goes across the upper back. The thighs are almost totally filled in, goes around the junk, up into the butt crack, and it finishes in the belly button. In the belly button. So it's intense. Takes 32 to 40 hours. You don't take a break. I mean, you take a break like day to day. You may have a day or two off, but you don't leave it unfinished. Has to be finished.
Because you have to let the initial punctures heal before you can keep going, right?
No. You take breaks so you don't you take they'll tattoo for 12 hours at a stretch. Right? So who gets it? Let me back up. You get it in theory when you're ready to commit yourself to the service of your chiefs, your village. Samoa is a village-based society where local chiefs run things, a series of chiefs. Each village has multiple chiefs. So even though Western Samoa is independent and quote unquote Eastern Samoa is an American territory called American Samoa, both of them are still largely governed at the local village level. And to sit among chiefs, you need to have you traditionally have a pea as a male or a malu for some women. Malu is less intense, but similar on the thighs for women. And there's a whole creation myth around this, but you get permission from your elders. You're basically representing your chiefs and villages. So your family, your chief are going to give you permission and bless it, and may even help you then pay for the whole thing. And it's a whole family affair. Just to give you a sense of that, like even from the diaspora, the Samoans from the diaspora outside of Samoa, they don't come to get a pea alone. They bring their whole family. So it may take 30 days, and it's a hugely big event for the whole family. So I think I was at one day of tattooing in Hawaii, and there were some Samoans coming from, I think the person getting the pea was coming from Georgia, but he had family come in from Alaska and Georgia. They all came in, and only a couple people were getting the tattoos. Everybody else just came to be there for this thing, right? So one, the answer is when you're ready to commit yourself to your chief, and then two, when your family has the resources to pull this together for you, because it's a huge commitment. what it means is you're at the beck and call of your chief for the rest of your life, which is a completely normal thing for Samoans. That's how they've been raised in the islands. That's you know, that's all you have. But nowadays in the diaspora community, it's even kind of more, it's more telling. It says that despite the fact that I'm way far away, I am willing to come back and be ready and be of service when called, when needed. And that could mean coming back, that can mean sending money back, but it usually has some strong representation. The documentary we've been working on is meant to sort of spell this out. The first half of the documentary, which we filmed in July 2019 when I was there collecting data, we interviewed a Samoan man who wanted to get the payout, and we talked to his whole family. Like his brothers came in, his wife, like the whole family was a part of this decision-making process. And so we talked to him, and it was so super emotional. And then we filmed him getting it, and his family would come to all the sessions, right, and sit there, and they fan him, and they talk to him, and you have a whole intensive process of getting these things that involves massaging the skin, showering, washing it down, right? Because as you said, there's a healing process, but no, you don't wait for it to heal. Like there's nightly massaging, right? Because they got to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Massaging, ritual prohibitions, no sex, no alcohol, things like this, right, during the process. And then when it's over, you have a new status, right? You're tattooed, right? One common expression, and this is another I'll translate to English, is simply it's meant to be the expression is, do you have a tattoo? And what it means is, do you have a credible, if you don't have a tattoo, shut the fuck up. You don't know what you're talking about. That's basically how it translates. Sorry. If you don't have a tattoo, shut the bleep up.
There you go. So between like family members who get tattoos, would they be the same? Like, say I had a brother and he got one also. Would our tattoos be similar, or would they be?
They'd be identical. Yeah, the design is the same design. We've seen the same design on evidence that of the design changing. There's been almost no change in the design over time, especially with the main guilds, right? So if we're talking, when we look at some of these cultural trajectories, right? With Samoa, what we see is hundreds of years of consistent design integrity, and the tattoo design is all over the culture. You see the same designs in Siapo. I'm gonna just, instead of getting up, I'm gonna see if I can show you. Up there is Siapo. That is actually the Pea design that goes on the hips. And Siapo is bark cloth. That is the textile that they had in Samoa before cotton was introduced by Westerners. You see wood carvings with the same design. Here's one more. This is the Malu design. It's a little harder to see that one. But same thing, the Malu design is in the women, and those designs resemble the crisscrossing patterns holding pole beams together in the bungalows in their homes, right? So they have cultural significance. Their designs you see all over the place. And the exceptions tend to be one, if people already have tattoos, they will fit these around them. So in some cases you see, there are a few great ones in this book that Sean Mallon and Sebastian Gallio put out last year, Tatao, the one I mentioned, of some World War II era tattoos, because the US Navy had a station in American Samoa then, and a lot of folks were tattooed, and they actually integrated some of the US military logos into the pea. There are a few people practicing today who have introduced some design innovations that tends to become controversial because of who's allowed to do those kinds of things and what they mean. Samoans are very conservative. The people allowed to make changes are supposed to be chiefs, and there are 2 to 3 guilds, depending on who you ask, but a lot of politics involved, as with any human enterprise. So, far be it. So when I relay what I know about them, it's from Sulawape Patelo Aliva'a, the High Chief, who most people defer to as the final authority, and some of the literature, but they will tell you that there are some innovations that people are making today, especially in fusing Pacific styles and styles from around the world. And it's okay for them to do that depending on how they represent themselves. So in other words, the word Sua is both a name and a guild title. Sulawape is both a name and a guild title. The family name, the two main guilds of Samoan tattooing are Sua and Tuluena. There's a creation story from like supposedly a couple hundred years ago, how tattooing was brought to Samoa, and the families who the original families that tattoo were the Sua and the Tuluena, and they supposedly have passed it down generation after generation. So if you learn in those styles and with those tools, a master craftsman will give you a set of tools and allow you in a ceremony to use those names. And once you get those names, Sua becomes your first name. So we call all of these guys Sua, which doesn't become confusing at all. And furthermore, the family who carry the Sua title are the Sulawape family. And because of the innovations the High Chief has made to maintain the integrity, they also now use their last name, their family name, as a title as well. So when they train people, the first name they get is Sulawape. So you have a lot of people practicing hand style tattooing in the world who, if you look on their websites, it will say Sulawape Ricky, Sulawape Angela, Sulawape, there's several of them. If they are super, super trusted by the family, they may be given the Sua title also. So then they become Sua Sulawape. Isaiah is one in Honolulu. I can't remember who else. There's only a few. Sua Sulawape Angela. There's only a few people in the world who get both titles. But so there are these elaborate politics involved, is I guess the short answer.
So you said that the Samoans are conservative in this practice. Does that mean it hasn't, like the symbology of the tattooing hasn't changed very much over time? It's
Correct.
The symbols they've always used.
Yep. And that's where that sort of long monologue there was sort of getting at, both in terms of how they're administered, the order that they're put on, and the symbols that they use are super, super conservative. And it's how they can do it so fast, right? Because they tattoo the same symbols over and over and over again. Even if you get a Samoan tattoo as a Palangi or white person, right? Meaning you probably aren't getting that traditional pea or malu, but you get something else. They use the same designs. They just sort of rearrange them in different patterns.
Well, I guess that makes it easier on the person doing the tattooing because they don't have to change the way they're doing things. It's just, a streamlined process. You do one, you know exactly how it's supposed to look from that point on.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my attitude towards flash tattooing changed completely in my over the course of my life in doing this research, because I came up in the what are we calling it now? I don't know, the nouveau. There's a word for the modern tattooing style where every tattoo is a piece of art that is custom designed, right, by you and the tattoo artist, versus a previous era when tattoos were pre-drawn designs and you go pick one off of a wall and they would administer it. I've learned both the Americana style has its own chic, right? But also, and this anecdote sort of it was my favorite to sort of explain this. I saw one of these master, they're called Tafunga Tatatao. That's the Samoan word for a master handcraft tattooist. I saw a Tafunga giving tattoos to these Coast Guard guys in American Samoa. And one of the Coast Guard guys goes, "I'd like a lighthouse." And the Tafunga says, "Okay, you'll get a shark." And that's what he gave him, right? And the guy's like, "Why would you give me a lighthouse?" He's like, "Well, I've never done a lighthouse. If you really want me to give you a lighthouse, I can, but it might just look," I'm sorry, I'm not gonna curse, but it might look like it might look more like a male genitalia on your leg than it does a lighthouse, right? You're better off letting me tattoo you with designs that I know how to tattoo, and I've done a lot, because I'm really good at those and they will look good. And I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Why you're not going to go to an artist who specializes in these pictures and say, "No, I want you to draw my dog."
Yeah, that's just
because I've never that rose picture a million times and it's going to look popping.
Yeah. So, what can we as historians or archaeologists learn from tattoos or the art of tattooing?
Well, I think as one of the oldest forms of self-decoration and body manipulation, it is the preeminent, in some ways, form of human civilization or human cultural elaboration that is above and beyond anything we see in our non-human mammal or primate cousins. Like, it is so indelibly unique that if we're not paying attention to this use of the body, I mean, what other animals injure themselves to enhance their social solidarity or enhance their individuality than do humans? So looking for evidence of that type of behavior. Now, it doesn't just have to be tattooing, right? This is where we get into any form of body modification. But the idea of injuring oneself to enhance one's social status, injuring oneself to make oneself stand out as an individual, if that, like, it tells us so much about the values of the culture that the person is in, and the sophistication of their sense of individual versus group versus one group versus other group, and marking out, this is us and not you, right? One of the first layers we could start to see. Anyone can fake being a member of a group by wearing a garment. It is a lot harder to fake a tattoo that identifies you as a group, to blend in.
So this is how I end every episode. What would you recommend to somebody who wants to get started learning about the history of tattooing itself, or cultural practices like tattooing?
There's tons and tons and tons of great books out there, but I'll point you to a few of my favorite. I will advertise my podcasts.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
Inking of Immunity podcast, because this is the question that we're asking, and we're using a podcast to do our research for a book we eventually want to write about how tattooing is emblematic of human nature, right? And so that'll both explore the Samoan research that I've been doing and looking at immune response, but also we started off interviewing Aaron Dieter Wolf for a reason. We find that the Ancient Ink book and the work that they're doing, exploring the antiquity of tattooing and these mummies, is the starting point for understanding the historical trajectory. And then from there, it'll send you down all sorts of winding trails of fascination. Like I'll just throw out one of my favorite sort of discoveries is that tattooing was not eradicated during the colonial period, even though we always suggest that Francis Cook saw it in the Pacific and reintroduced it to the European population. That was more among the English. The French don't seem to have ever gotten rid of it. Maybe didn't practice it as much, but you saw French fur traders and voyageurs, and even the folks who founded, those of us in the South know, the French Bienville and Iberville brothers founded New Orleans, Biloxi, and Mobile. They are reputed to have tattooed themselves in native designs because tattoos, or what you wear or how you look, tells who you're talking about, if you're friend or foe. Much like in military campaigns, looking for the banner, looking for the uniforms is how you tell friend from foe. So when they would go back to France, they would wear the powdered wigs and all the pomp to show themselves to be Frenchmen. But when they would trade and negotiate with the natives, they'd strip down to the loincloths so their tattoos would be visible. So they would be trusted as interlocutors. I just find that fascinating. So Aaron Dieter Wolf's work and other archaeologists in this region have explored those things. And I think the Museum of Alabama, Museum of Mobile, had an exhibit on this at one point. I don't know if it's still up down there, but there's so many great threads to pursue in exploring the importance of tattooing, both among native peoples, but then how those tendrils stretch into our modern world.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap up this episode. Chris, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Sorry for the F-bomb.
No, it's fine.
My poor students. They don't have anyone there to tell me to stop.